First Avenue is a former railroad corridor in Council Bluffs, Iowa. The 66-foot wide right-of-way that stretches from downtown Council Bluffs to downtown Omaha is currently undergoing a transformation that will soon feature trails, transit, and redevelopment.
Now, where is First Avenue? You're all familiar with West Broadway, and then it jumps to Second Avenue. You ever wonder why that happened? For many, many years, there was a railroad, the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, ran through what was platted originally as First Avenue. So it wasn't kind of a typical arrangement for a railroad. It was just laid out in the city's right-of-way.
When the city of Council Bluffs was platted, they platted that road. They platted First Avenue. But they also knew how important railroads were going to be used. There were a bunch of railroads that came through Council Bluffs. Well, that took up a lot of space. So First Avenue was platted from the very beginning as a street, but it was built from the very beginning as a railroad.
So not too long ago, when the tracks were pulled up, it basically reverted back to the city as public right-of-way.
There were customers, lots and lots of customers along that line, down to Frito-Lay. Bungie Elevator was down on the far end. It served industrial customers all the way along there. You still see the remnants of a lot of those industrial customers. But by the time it was in the 1970s, 1980s, that railroad was really not very active. It was running maybe one train a week, but railroads are common carriers. The railroad can't just decide to abandon a line. So while the citizens and TJ students and the city and everybody in Council Bluffs said, could you just stop running trains one time a week on that railroad? Or more specifically, could you stop parking cars in the way so students can't get to their classes, which did happen on occasion? Railroads, when they're presented with freight that meets all of the requirements the federal government sets, is obligated by law to carry that freight. And railroads don't have the option of telling a customer that they won't do it. So they can't just stop service to Bungie. As long as Bungie wants service for its elevator or thinks it might sometime in the future want service, the railroad does not have the authority to abandon the line. So while the community wanted that line to be abandoned for decades, the railroad never had the authority to do it. When I worked for Union Pacific, I was involved with the railroad end of this equation because we were getting, I'd get Tom Hannafin, could you just stop running trains? Could you move those cars? Yes, but they're just going to come back again. But when AVE went in down there by TJ, because they were going to build a road that was going to have a fair amount of travel over an active rail line, because that's how it was classified by the federal government, they were going to have to put in a very heavy-duty crossing, and they were going to have to put in a lot of protections, crossing protections there. And crossing protections are extremely expensive, not just a crossbuck, but actually arms. This was going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. And AVE essentially said, yeah, we're not going to do that. You got to figure this out. So the city came back again, and at that time they came to the Iowa West Foundation. So here's where my life comes in full circle, now at the Iowa West Foundation. And they said, okay, let's get together and figure out how we can get Bungie to move their operation. They moved, they closed it. That allowed the railroad to decide to abandon that line, and then the city could acquire it. And normally, abandonment of a railroad line is a multi-year process because all of the customers have to agree and all sorts of other things have to happen at the federal level. But remember what this is? The platted street. Never did belong to the railroad. They just had authority to operate in it. So when the railroads abandoned the line, they simply gave up that ability to operate. It immediately reverted back to the city. And then Brandon came along and said, let's build a rail-to-trail.
There has been a lot of work, especially over the last 15 to 20 years, to start to transition this area from that railroad and industrial corridor that it was since the beginning of time for Council Bluffs to what is maybe now more of a mixed-use environment, focusing on new residential, attracting new people to the metro and to Council Bluffs, and focusing on quality of life improvements that are beneficial for both existing residents and our newcomers.
So here's what's remarkable. I've worked for the railroad in a dozen states and did a whole bunch of rails to trails and worked with communities all over the place. This is a treasure, and it is because the railroad protected this corridor. And it protected it in a way that most communities don't have. And it always belonged to the city, so they never had to buy it back. It's never been divided into pieces. You have this straight shot corridor that connects two metro areas that is entirely developable, whether it's for economic or residential or transit. This ties Council Bluffs and Omaha in a way that actually addresses the kinds of development that we see are really attracting young people to return back home. They want areas where they can really engage in activities, areas where they can walk, walkable communities, places they don't have to have a car to get to work. And this corridor, they didn't have to buy it back. They didn't have to coordinate with the federal government. A lot of these trails, and this is the Rails to Trails concept, most people don't understand. Rails to Trails is a federal designation that essentially says this is a transportation corridor that should be protected for transportation use, and the highest best use for it right now today is for pedestrian and bicyclists. But in 10 years from now, any of those corridors could be converted back to a different kind of transit because it's simply a protected transportation corridor. There are some instances where some of those rail bank corridors, you buy this great condo and you have a trail out back. Well, now it's maybe a transit corridor. Maybe it's a bus corridor. They've been converted back. That's not the case here. The city owns this and it's permanently protected. So these developers who are willing to put in 200 apartment units know that they'll never run the risk of having that turned back into some sort of a transportation corridor. This is a treasure, and it's going to really put Council Bluffs on the map.
And just to echo those comments even further, that a metro of our scale, this metro is approaching 1 million people probably within the next 10 to 15 years. And I challenge you to find a corridor that is as preserved and as prime for redevelopment in such an urban core near a downtown, or even better yet, between two districts like this. I just don't think you'll find it. And it's perfectly straight, it's perfectly flat, it's unobstructed, and we own it.
So there's lots of people who remember downtown Council Bluffs, who remember crazy days and walking down Broadway and going into all the old stores, and who to this very day regret the fact that all of those stores were torn down and you miss those wonderful, wonderful stores. Consider this to be the replacement, because this re-energizes those walkable areas where people engage in commerce by going from one store to another, where there'll be a brew pub and a restaurant and they live close by. We lost all those fabulous old buildings, and we will never get them back, but we can do something like this to recreate a corridor in Council Bluffs that brings back that sense of community and that sense of home.
I love so many things about this corridor, as you can probably tell, but the topography in this area is just perfect for this kind of development and these types of improvements because it's very flat ground. It's on a very gridded part of the city, which makes it extremely accessible for people walking, biking, going on their scooters, whatever it may be. It makes the entire corridor very accessible. So what I like to talk about is the big picture here and connections. The First Avenue multi-use trail will cut right through the heart of our community, 1 block south of West Broadway, where we have all those businesses and employment. And you have a huge neighborhood to the north, large neighborhood to the south. So all of these residents will then have access not only within the corridor, but then to access the rest of the network and over the Bob Carey Bridge if they wish to go that far. What we're also part of, Great American Rail Trail. This is a nationwide effort to lead a trail from Washington, D.C. through Council Bluffs, First Avenue. Their crossing point is here at the Bob Carey Bridge and then out to Washington State. So this concept that we have for First Avenue, we have 66 feet of right-of-way. How did we want to design that? We could design a real wavy trail that just takes up the entire 66 feet. Or we could think about perhaps options in the future. So we did offset it kind of to the south side. So we just used half of it. We're going to plant the other to green space. So the trail itself is 14 feet wide. So we have 2 feet of concrete 10 feet of asphalt, 2 feet of concrete through this. The idea here is you have a smooth, continuous surface, which is very conducive to numerous types of users. So we call it a multi-use trail. We don't call it a bike trail. We have people that are walking and jogging. Maybe we have competitions there at some point, some 5Ks or fun runs. We have people with different mobility or ability that we need to be mindful of. That smooth, continuous surface is perfect for people of different abilities. We also didn't just shoot the trail down the way. We did kind of, rather than meander it, we went straight shots but angled them up and down the blocks so that you get these view corridors of these trees. And we have very intentional plantings of the trees where we selected fall foliage plantings. We have a lot in our budget towards lighting. We have these LED light fixtures that will help make it a safe trail 24 hours. So back to our railroad history. We have these trail plazas every 3 to 4 blocks, but we wanted to kind of make a nod again back to our industrial and railroad history. So you can see that the materials that we chose are more of an industrial type of palette, where we went with some concrete and like I-beam type construction. Even the benches are designed to look like bundles of lumber or something waiting to be picked up by a train. What's also good about that is that it would be easily maintained and replaced as needed with materials that we can procure. Another piece of thinking here is art pedestals. We did include in our design pedestals for future art installations, and as many of you are aware, we have a lot of businesses along West Broadway. Well, a lot of those businesses, or all of those businesses really, have their backs to First Avenue. And I think that would be a great opportunity for public art or mural program, and really just start to fill up that corridor with all these different layers where I talked about the fall color, the sculptures, the seating areas and plazas, the public art. The head librarian, Antonia, she said, I want to do little libraries at the plaza. It's like, yeah, great, let's do it. Dr. Warner said, hey, what if we did some historic plaques along? There's a lot of history in this. Yeah, let's do it. We have lots of layers we can add to this. But last but not least, do we have an opportunity for future transit? Omaha has talked a lot about a streetcar between UNMC and downtown. Do we have that as an opportunity? Our 2015 Broadway Master Plan included a concept in First Avenue with transit. How would we make that connection then to Omaha? A new multimodal bridge would be necessary to take that. But in terms of Council Bluffs, we're not seriously thinking of streetcar unless Omaha has a system to connect to. We're not planning a standalone streetcar system.
So this is such an exciting project. I mean, the history of Council Bluffs, it's a railroad town. It's a river town. It's a hard-working, work hard, play hard kind of town. And over the years, we've lost a lot. But some of the things that we haven't lost are some of these great old corridors. And to be able to go back and say, okay, we're going to take what we have. We're going to take this wonderful First Avenue corridor and turn it into something that really is exciting. There's a lot of cities that probably will pay hundreds of millions of dollars to have this kind of a linear development that will really re-energize the community. So this is an exciting opportunity, and it really ties the history of the town to the future of the town.
So if you want some more information about this, we do have a podcast. Ashley Cruz, the city's communications officer, and I are co-hosts on a podcast. You can find that on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or on onfirstcb.com. The name of the podcast is On First. All of our information, we put everything that we have available is on this website, firstavecb.com.